I'm Claudia, and I'm a social scientist from the University of Vienna. And I'm presenting first results from a research project I started a year ago. It's a 3-year project funded by the European Union. And I kind of changed the title of my presentation in 3 ways. First, I put quotation marks to the illegal because there was some response on the Breaking Convention Facebook page to my title, kind of assuming that I kind of take this, that I take it as given that molecules are illegal, but I think all of us know that the illegal is socially constructed. So just to emphasize that. And then I kind of broadened my view away from medicalization to socio-psychedelic imaginaries, which is what I will be talking today. So most of us will know that in the reemergence of psychedelic research in the 21st century now, the focus has been on medicalization. So we've seen a lot of clinical research now into the efficacy and safety of psychedelics, and this has really gained momentum throughout the recent years. And currently we have ongoing clinical trials with MDMA and psilocybin respectively, and these are in phase 2 with psilocybin, or at phase 3 with MDMA. And we have nonprofits and also now a for-profit organization doing this research. So many people now anticipate that within the next few years, if these clinical trials are successful, the 2 formerly illegal psychedelic substances will be approved by the FDA and also the EMA as licensed medicines for drug-assisted psychotherapy. And we all know, I guess, the organizations, MAPS for MDMA, assisted psychotherapy, Compass doing the psilocybin studies, and Usona now also doing the psilocybin research. If we look at medicalization, what are we actually talking about? So I like to understand medicalization as any process that is defining and treating non-medical problems as medical, and that is also making something a part of the Western medical system. And the fact that this process has expanded throughout the last decades in our society. So here medical does not equal healing. It's really about kind of putting something into the existing medical, Western medical model, medical system. Medicalization is a process that can go in 2 different directions. It can transform existing social structures and systems, and it can also reproduce something that's already existing in society. So in terms of transforming with psychedelics, we would see the legitimization of these illegal molecules, at least in specific medical settings. And we've also seen kind of empowerment of patients happening through medicalization in different areas, like the evidence-based activism in the realm of AIDS, HIV, or like with a lot of rare diseases, we've seen medicalization being used by patient organizations as a tool to gain more power and to kind of serve their own interests. On the other hand, medicalization is also reproducing things in society. So usually it's also coming along with a devaluing of non-scientific, non-medical ways of knowing and healing. It's also restricting and regulating who will have access to specific treatments. And if it's part of the medical system, of course, there are certain gatekeepers there, like doctors, who kind of then also, this is establishing or continuing as a certain societal order that we have established. My background is in particular in science and technology studies, so that's also the kind of the lens that I'm having to look at medicalization. And science and technology studies is exploring the ways in which science, technology, and medicine are co-emerging with society at the same time, and how these different spheres in a way mutually shape each other. In a very simple way, it's to say that values are always part of science, always part of medicine. It's not separate. So this kind of questions this assumption that science and medicine are these objective observers of reality, kind of looking from outside. The main question that is guiding my interest here is, how do we as individuals and societies seek to contain and govern psychedelic experiences, be it through medicalization or other models of control? And in this project in particular, I'm trying to gain a better understanding of how the central actors in the psychedelic research community envision, seek to steer, and also critique the medicalization of psychedelics in the United States. So my focus is on the United States as a national context, because many of you may know here the clinical trials are most farthest along, and so it looks like the FDA will be the first regulatory agency to kind of approve psychedelic-assisted therapies in the next years. So this will have then an impact also on how this will turn out in other countries. I'm also doing this research not just because I want to further our scientific knowledge about that, but also because I hope to kind of stimulate reflexivity and imagination in the psychedelic community, in the research community, and also kind of guide our attempts to govern psychedelics in society. So I've come up with this notion of socio-psychedelic imaginaries. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to trace these in the material that I'm looking at. So in my field, SDS, there has been a very influential concept throughout the last years of sociotechnical imaginaries. And this refers to collectively held visions of how to reach desirable or avoid undesirable futures through innovations in science and technology. So I've changed this in the way that I'm not just focusing on science and technology, but also at the broader socio-psychedelic imaginaries that are kind of floating around. And so it's about how the people in the psychedelic community envision certain futures through the societal reintegration of psychedelic, which can include science but doesn't have to include science and technology. So for me, it's a way to kind of broaden the view, because that's a critique I have to the research that my colleagues are doing in science and technology studies, that they focus on just science and technology and leave out other movements that are happening in society that are equally important. And this notion of socio-psychedelic is for me also important because for three reasons. First, psychedelics are always socially embedded. We have the notion of setting that is also alluding to that. Second, their use is socially mediated by regulations and laws in our culture. And third, as a mind-revealing technology, psychedelics also allow us insights into social reality because the mind is socially shaped. In my research, I focus on three molecules that are kind of farthest along on the path to medicalization: ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin. And with ketamine, we also have a substance that is already medicalized, and that's kind of also functioning or having a very important role for the MDMA and psilocybin studies being done to kind of look to a substance that's already applied in medical settings and the problems that might emerge there. My empirical material is very diverse, but at the center is qualitative interviews that I'm conducting. mainly with scientists, therapists, policy advocates, psychedelic elders. This for me refers to anybody who was already active in the psychedelic space in the 60s, funders, activists, and also critics of medicalization. So what have I done so far in terms of doing these interview studies? So I did 16 interviews this year, and I'm currently at a very early stage of the analysis, so that's also why I'm presenting. I hope to get some feedback from you and to kind of see what kind of sticks with you or what kind of you would like to hear more about. And during the time when I did the interviews, so most of the interviews I did in May and June, and that was right at that moment when the decriminalization kind of was successful in two US cities in Denver and Oakland of psilocybin and other natural psychedelics. And then the Michael Pollan's New York Times opinion piece happened that kind of also engendered a lot of reactions in the psychedelic community. And for me, it really brought out that decriminalization is a very contested issue in the psychedelic community. And that then also was kind of reflected in my interviews. I brought it up, or the interviews brought it up, and it kind of showed to me that I have to move beyond the mere focus on the medicalization and also look at the decriminalization. So let me just now briefly sketch the main elements of the medicalization imaginary that I identified so far for me. So medicalization here is kind of constructed as a re-legitimization of psychedelics in the form of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and it's presented as a more effective mental health treatment than what we have currently available. The medicalization imaginary has also not just been successful so far in kind of moving through the medical system, but also in reestablishing the public trust in psychedelics. So that's kind of obvious if you look at the very positive media coverage that it generated. And medicalization is a way of kind of, the vision is to move psychedelics through science, through the medical systems, because these are the socially sanctioned and therefore considered safest roads for reintegrating psychedelics back into the society. And for this reason, quantitative and clinical research is being conducted mainly because that is obviously what is needed in the current system to gain regulatory approval. And the medicalization imaginary constructs psychedelics as an individual cure. It's kind of aiming to normalize people again and making them functional in society. It's held and supported by a range of people from diverse societal backgrounds. That's what has been always at the forefront of this imaginary by the main proponents like Rick Doblin, who has this understanding of it's about mainstreaming psychedelics, bringing them back into the mainstream of societies. And so, organizations like MAPS have also been taking like funding from different societal groups and like also more right-wing philanthropists, and they've also gotten some critique for that and so on. So in my interviews, this medicalization imaginary is, because most of the interviews I have been doing with researchers and therapists so far, and this is really the more official imaginaries that they hold, but they also have other visions, other imaginaries that are a little bit more private, I'd say. In the interviews and also in the general cultural sphere around psychedelics, we've already come across a lot of kind of challenges that the medicalization imaginary carries, and this has also sparked a lot of critique up until now. So the list would be a really long list actually, and I don't want to go into that into too much detail. But just to mention a few of these critiques. So there's a lot of hype at the moment around psychedelics, and many people, especially those having treatment-resistant mental health issues, certainly have their hopes up for a kind of cure. And there's the argument that, yeah, will these treatments then really kind of deliver what they are promising, or will people be set up for disappointment in the future? There's the question of who will have access to these treatments. Will the treatments be fairly distributed in society? So the affordability question. The diversity issue, will marginalized groups be included? There's been already some efforts to include some more people of color and so on, but this is certainly not kind of solved at the moment. Then there's the question of values. So we've already heard in the previous presentation, values are important for organizations. And the psychedelic community has always been in the past about being open and collaborative, and now more capitalist interests are kind of infiltrating the psychedelic community and bringing in patenting issues, more competitive behaviors. And like one of my interviewees said, yeah, problematic handshakes are happening now, and there's new gatekeepers coming in who don't have what we once called psychedelic values. There's the issue of misconduct, of exploiting underground and indigenous knowledge and not giving back, of the possibility of further stigmatization of non-medical users of psychedelics, and so on. So this is really a long list. But I want to move on to the other imaginaries that are also around, and it's not only about medicalization. There's also still the underground imaginary that some of the people hold. So it's about envisioning psychedelics flourishing also through this unregulated, illegitimate, hidden use for different than medical purposes. And this is seen as a really important counterforce to the problems of the medicalization imaginary. So like in this quote, person says, that's where I say, if it's going to be the second age of psilocybin in the West, then we better get growing a whole lot more mushrooms, because I think it's got to be the underground. The psychedelic underground is not over. So the underground is here also seen as a knowledge source that should be valued and accessed in the future, and that's also an invisible distribution system that's still holding up these kind of psychedelic values. And there are many arguments that are being made for why we as a community need to keep this imaginary alive. A kind of way of moving this underground imaginary a little bit overground is the kind of rising decriminalization imaginary that has especially kind of gained traction with the citywide decriminalization initiatives happening in the US. And yeah, it's about decriminalizing the personal use of specific psychedelics, and it's envisioning a future without enforced punishment, and it doesn't have the vision of any commercialization or kind of open distribution networks. And this imaginary is also already, I can see it kind of being a part of the psychedelic, also the research community, but the way it's kind of coming up is in very different shapes. So there's people just recognizing this imaginary as something that is, yeah, becoming more important. And some of the therapists are also having this imaginary as a more long-time imaginary for their own kind of work and mission. Although on the kind of more official level, they are promoting the medicalization imaginary. What I also came across in the interviews was a reaction similar to those of Michael Pollan in his first opinion piece, where some of the psychedelic researchers argued that they fear that the proliferation of this decrim imaginary, and its success might create a potential backlash and then jeopardize the psychedelic research. So it's basically the argument science first. But it's not about a general disapproval of decriminalization most of the time. It's more about the timing of these initiatives. Because many hold that we currently still lack the research necessary and the public education on safe use. So they fear that there could be potential adverse events that would not harm just individuals, but also the psychedelic community and the currently positive image of psychedelics. So like in these quotes, just let the research lead the way, and we need a little bit more time to gather data about drug reactions and certain risks. And finally, the legalization and or licensing imaginary is also kind of a little bit coming up in the interviews. It's about visions kind of similar to how cannabis is legalized or licensed in certain US states. But these visions are not really that prominent in my data so far. And I'd also say that it's less fleshed out culturally and still very much in flux. So there's a lot of questions here: which drugs to legalize or license, how, under supervision, what about commercialization? And here this quote of one of the interviewers: how do we make it then legally available? Is it through shops similar to truffles in the Netherlands? And who controls that then? Is it a state? Is it a government? So I think it gets a little bit trickier when we start to think about that. And that's kind of, what's it about. People are just starting to thinking about this imaginary. It's not really fleshed out. But yeah, the statewide ballot initiative in Oregon that is also trying to start a regulatory program would be another example for this imaginary. And this is just, starting to kind of emerge in society at the moment. What I try to kind of think about is how can I map these socio-psychedelic imaginaries in the social space and their kind of relations with each other. And for me, I found it important to kind of draw a line of societal legitimization here and to kind of put the medicalization imaginary beyond that line, because it's the imaginary that has already gotten this legitimization, and the decrim imaginary kind of trying to move beyond that line and finding now the pushback from the medicalization imaginary that science should be first. So there's a boundary issue going on here. And also the legalization imaginary is kind of trying to come up. As I said, it's still very early stage of my research, and I have a lot of more to analyze and theorize. So I'm certainly going to carve out the nuances of the imaginaries more and their differences between them, their internal differences. I want to tease out the relations between specific imaginaries and social positions. So who is holding which imaginaries for which reasons? And then in the end, also kind of say, are these reasonable reasons? So are the researchers who are kind of pushing back against the decrim imaginary, do they have good reasons for why they think it's threatening? Or are they kind of suffering from an anxiety themselves that is kind of reproducing certain fears and structures of society? I also want to look more at cannabis as an analogy that is guiding imagination in the psychedelic realm. The panel yesterday on cannabis was really interesting in that respect. So, and it's also for many of the interviewees something that they mentioned themselves. So like, I'm looking towards cannabis when I'm thinking about psychedelics and their role in society in the future. I also want to explore that the fact that the medicalization of psychedelics is actually also a demedicalization process in certain ways. So it's like going into the medical system and trying to change something at the same time with the mystical experiences. And some of the therapists I talked to also said that their view on disease categorizations changed throughout their work with psychedelics and so forth. So that's also interesting. And finally, I think it's important to ask also whether a deeper questioning of societal structures and the social conditions that contribute to these specific mental conditions that are treated with psychedelics, whether this is also possible to kind of reflect upon inside of the medical model. And I think what I would like to call for is more qualitative research also with study participants and other users on how their worldviews changed and the knowledge that they gained through the process of being in these studies or conducting their own experiential research. And it's not only of knowledge about the transformation that they have undergone, but I think there's also some important knowledge there, maybe on the genesis of their conditions. And what I'm myself envisioning as a social scientist is that we could more collaboratively kind of work with these people and in a more participatory action research kind of way. And that sociologists and the knowledge of these people that we together can criticize also the more systemic issues that are kind of plaguing society. Thank you, and I'm really happy if you have any feedback or questions, and talk to me.